Good morning. Welcome to the Bread of Life channel. I'm so excited to have SJ Thomason here. She is a Christian apologist, and she's going to talk about why she loves Jesus and kind of share her story. And a lot of you already know her. Anyway, I'm excited to have you here today, SJ. Thanks for being here. Do you want to tell people a little bit about yourself for those who don't know you?
Sure, thank you. I'm very excited to be here too. So I'm a professor, a management professor, actually, business management, and I teach courses. I just finished teaching courses in a southeastern university, and I just finished for the summer cleaning the courses. So I'm done now until August, and I love that job, but it's not a job that I can really share my Christianity. So one of the reasons why I like to go on YouTube is because it's a little outlet for me to share why I'm a Christian and why I believe what I do believe. And so, thank you.
Cool. That's awesome. And your YouTube channel is SJ Thomason, and it's the link is in the description for those who'd like to check that out. And so, do you want to tell us how you came to know the Lord?
Yeah, I've always known that there is a God. I think that's really clear. I think we see that in nature, and I can see through the book of nature that there is evidence that there's a creator. And I think even when you look into the sky at night, and you see all of the stars and the amazing cosmos and some of the pictures that they have shown from NASA, it gives us a lot of evidence that there is a creator. And even the story of the Big Bang and all of that kind of stuff gives us evidence there was a start date for the universe. And so I've always had that belief, but I wasn't always sure about Christianity. And so I was raised as a Catholic, but then I kind of fell away for a long time. And I was thinking Eastern faiths were much more exotic and interesting. And so I started looking into Buddhism and those kind of faiths. And I ended up coming back to Christianity through a process. I think it was a long process that God just started opening up all these doors and windows for me and giving me spiritual experiences, dreams, visions. I even one time audibly heard the voice of God telling me not to do something, sort of telling me I was doing something wrong. And so it was very, very nice voice of reason. And so I changed my ways. And of course, I'm not a fool. You don't listen to the discipline coming from the one who disciplines, you're a fool. And so that was an issue there. But I'm just very excited about Christianity. And so it was funny because I had one little teeny Bible in my house when Jesus started making himself very known to me. And it was just one of those little half Bibles that only had the New Testament and the Psalms and the Proverbs. And it wasn't until about then, after going into a church and really being just completely in awe of the experience I had in church, because at Catholic churches, it's always very solemn and you have hymns and people stand up and sit down and follow this little process. And it's very much based on sacraments and that kind of thing. But I went into a Baptist church and I just was amazed by the contemporary music and the power and the 40-minute sermon where the pastor really dug into the Bible. And I just thought, wow, this is really something incredible. So I went and got baptized again. And I still, even though I got baptized and I said, Jesus is Lord, I still had these little teeny glimmers of doubt in the back of my mind. And it wasn't until my eyes were totally opened one day after, I've mentioned it before, but sitting next to a pastor on a plane who shared mere Christianity with me. And then I read the trilemma because I thought that Jesus was just this great moral teacher. And I thought, oh my gosh, it was just my eyes just totally opened at that point. It was like the scales, like Paul, just fell off my eyes. And it was right around then. And so that was about 2011, 2012. And ever since then, I've been very much trying to share the good news and try to live a better life and be a better example of Jesus to others.
Cool. Now, there's a couple things I wanted to touch on. At the beginning, you were saying that you've always known there was a God, and I feel the same way. But there's like a lot of people who watch my channel who don't see that. So, what do you think what are they missing? Why did you always know that and I always know that, but why aren't others able to see that?
I think it's what you focus on in the world, because I think that one of the main reasons why a lot of people don't believe in God or don't think there is a loving God is because they look out in the world and they see examples of evil. And
Mhm.
sometimes even they look at other Christians, and some of those other Christians are pretty rotten. And so when they look at that and they say, if there's a loving God and those are his witnesses, I don't want any part of that. And so they just sort of turn away and focus again on things like little strange little passages in the Bible that they think are examples of God being not so nice. And so they do that kind of stuff, and then they sort of deny him. And then as they go through the process of denying, God sends a powerful, as they say in Romans, God sends a powerful delusion to them so that they can look out into the world and think there actually is no God. And I think that's where a lot of them are, unfortunately.
Mm. I just wanted to put this comment up. Nano says, best friends in the making. Well, you know what? I have to say, I'm so excited to have a female apologist on, because I feel like I'm mostly having conversations with men all the time.
Hmm.
And so it's quite exciting whenever there's a woman involved. And Godless Girl is in the chat, and I'm excited that she's around too. Um, so yeah,
Hi,
it could be
Godless
best
Girl.
friends in the making.
Yeah, we just
Yeah.
started following each other on Twitter again. And so she was, I think we were following each other on my other account, but now she's following this new account. So it's nice. She's pretty funny. I get a kick out of her.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so what was interesting is you said before your experience on the plane, but where you really open your eyes to see who Jesus was already speaking to you in dreams and that kind of stuff. So can
Oh
you give
no,
an
I
oh,
shouldn't say that. It wasn't in that order. The dreams came after.
okay. Okay.
So he wasn't the way he was speaking to me before that is the very first thing started happening was we used to skip church all the time. We never went to church. And so we would go once in a blue moon when my mother-in-law came in town or something like that because she wanted to go. But I remember my son looking around at the neighbors and saying, "Mom," and this was probably about June of maybe 2011, "Mom, I noticed that all the neighbors go to church on Sundays." And I was taking him to the community pool Sunday mornings because I thought how nice it was that no one was there. so, so it was funny. That was the first thing. And so I felt kind of guilty. So it was probably June that summer we decided to start trying churches out because we went to a Lutheran church. We didn't really feel comfortable there. The Catholic church, I don't know. My husband's Lutheran, so we tried the Lutheran church and we were married in the Lutheran church. But then we walked in that one Baptist church and I was blown away. And that following September, I was baptized. And it wasn't until the February after that that I started really coming around. That's when I was on the plane, February following that baptism. But in each of these things, every time I went to the church, I felt a powerful presence and I felt that Jesus was there, but I didn't even bother looking at any sort of resurrection evidence or anything, which was pretty lame on my part. It was really, really lame. And then after that, I had a couple of dreams. It wasn't a lot. Actually, wait a second. When were those dreams? Yeah, right around 2014, 2013 is when I had a couple of dreams. And somewhere between 2014 and then I got on Twitter in 2014 and started getting pretty. I mean, I was on Twitter on this one account that I have since 2010, but I didn't use the account. So, but yeah, so that was it.
So when you first read the Bible, what surprised you about it?
Good question. So, yeah, and that was the other thing. As Catholics, we don't really read the Bible too much. We don't memorize passages. We don't do all that. Oh, actually, I can't say that. I did memorize Psalm 23 because I used a squirt pen and hit the bus driver on the way to school one day, and the nuns made me memorize Psalm 23. So I did memorize one passage, but I had not read most of the Old Testament, and I had not read most of the New Testament, even, believe it or not. I hadn't even read that. And so I picked it up, and I was really surprised about Jesus as a person, because I think people make him out to be like this Barney character, and he's not. He spoke truth to power. He called people out for who they were. He's got all kinds of dimensions. And I noticed that we hear that he cried, but we never read that he laughed, or we never read that he chuckled or anything like that. So it's really interesting. You think to yourself, well, did Jesus crack jokes ever? And the way they make him out on The Chosen is, yeah, he sure did. He's got this whole different dimension of a personality on The Chosen, which I think they're taking a few too many liberties there. But But I was surprised at Jesus's character, who he is, and how he's very, very much of very strong. My pastor said something, calls him, what did he say? He said he's meek is not weakness, but restrained power. And I think that's what Jesus is. So he has restrained power. He could have done some miracles that would have absolutely blown people away. Like he was walking on water. That's a pretty gentle miracle, or turning water to wine, or doing things like that were pretty gentle miracles. And he could have done something like, let's just pick up the ocean and make it rush up to the sky. And there's all these things he could have done that would have scared the bejesus out of people. But I think that surprised me the most.
Cool. And what did you love most about Jesus, or what do you love most about Jesus?
I love how he it's like you're going in a battle. This world is kind of like a battle, your spiritual warfare, things are going on all the time. And he took the bullet for us. He's like that soldier who runs into battle for you and runs in front of you and takes the bullet. And I think that act of mercy and kindness is so incredible, because when I watch The Passion and I see what he did with the cross, where it was so it brought tears to my eyes. I think Mel Gibson did a really good job with that, because it just gives you the human side of Jesus, and how they beat him and how they hated him, and how at the very last minute he forgave him for all of that stuff. He said, Father, forgive them for what they do. They know not what they do. And I think, wow, here's a totally innocent person wrongly accused, and people are violating every aspect of the 10 Commandments, wrongly accusing him, doing all these things, thou shalt not kill. They're out there killing him. They bearing false witness against him. They're doing all this stuff. And what does he do? He turns around and he forgives them. And that just tells us how big of a heart he has. And even that he sits there on the cross, and these two people around him initially are mocking him. And then the one realizes, wait a second, let me go to heaven with you. And Jesus opens the door to this guy. And he clearly wasn't living a very good life. He was there deservedly. He knew he deserved to be there. And so you just realize the forgiveness that he has, and the righteous justice and forgiveness, and how he reconciled that justice and the mercy of God on the cross. And so it's perfect.
Awesome. Yeah, I agree. And so you mentioned does Jesus have a sense of humor? In your experience with your relationship with God, does he have a sense of humor?
Yes, I think I think he is. I think we wouldn't have a sense of humor if it didn't come from our Creator. I think he probably has an amazing sense of humor. And I think it's going to be something that we'll probably be laughing quite a bit when we're with him in heaven. So.
Yeah, I feel like he makes jokes with me quite a lot. And I find him to be so much fun. So what do you think, like, people miss about Jesus? Like what do you want people to know about Jesus that you think they might not know?
I think they don't know that some people say, I have been praying and praying and praying, and it seems like God doesn't answer my prayers. And I remember praying and praying and praying in my 30s, and maybe it seemed like God doesn't answer all of my prayers. I wanted to know the truth, so I was really, really specific. And it took him years to finally open my eyes. And it wasn't because it took him years, the way I'm saying that. It was because it took me years to finally be in the position where he figured I was ready to learn. Because once he opens your eyes, there's no turning back. You can't just suddenly turn around and be totally dishonest to do that after he's opened your eyes. And so he must have realized in my 30s, no. And so what I would want other people to know is be patient. God will open your eyes, but you have to be ready for it, and you have to really sincerely want it. And I probably in my 30s wasn't ready for it. And it might take years, it might take 30 years, 40 years. Sometimes God waits all the way until the end of your life. Like you look at people like God waited a long time to open the eyes of Cy Gart, and Cy, what was he, in his 60s or something when God did that? So it could take a long time. So if those of you who are very young, and I know there's a lot of really young people in your crowd right now, if you're ready, and Sarah Salviander said this so well. He said, if you are ready, when you're ready, God will send a teacher to open your eyes. And I think that was the idea of the pastor on the plane for me. And I know that there's others like me who probably have those kind of experiences too.
Yeah. Awesome. What are your favorite books of the Bible?
Oh, that's a good question. I keep changing my mind on that. So I keep changing my mind. I can say from the Old Testament, my very, very favorite books are Daniel and Isaiah. I absolutely love Daniel and Isaiah, and I read those books over and over. And I'm still trying to work on a book on Isaiah. I have my take on Isaiah, and I started it, I think, about a year ago. I started forever ago, and I stopped because I was working on academic papers for my school, and I've switched gears to really focus on that because I wanted to amp up my research pipeline. But I love those two books. And then in the New Testament, I love all four Gospels. And so, but if I had to pick one, I love the fact that Matthew really digs into all the prophecies and he reveals so many prophecies to us and shares the Jewishness of the the, the New Testament with us. And so I love that. But I love John's language because it's written so beautifully. I'm talking about how the word became flesh and dwelt
Yeah.
among us. That's absolutely beautiful. And then I love the books of Ephesians and Hebrews. And there's so many. But I also think if you want to be inspired, read the book of Acts and look at how the
Mhm.
apostles went out to very first start preaching for Jesus. So I think that's heavily inspirational.
Yeah, actually, speaking of that, I'm going to try to find this comment that was back here. So Floyd said, and Jesus said his followers would do greater acts than he did. I'd like to see some. So when we read the book of Acts, we see all these the disciples doing great works. Do
Mhm.
you think, like, what do you think about that? Do you apply that to your life today, or how do you think that applies?
I think that's that question of can we perform miracles in the name of God? And I think that there are miracles going on still all around the world today. And I think that God certainly does work through some people. And sometimes he's even working through some doctors in certain ways to help people out. And so I haven't personally been able to perform any sort of miracles. I've never tried to do anything like speak in tongues or anything quite like that. I don't that just doesn't come natural to me. I wouldn't even know how to do that. And so that's something. But I think that um I don't know. It's a tough one. So I think that God is working through some people today. I think he's still performing miracles today. There's lots of examples, and I've talked about Barbara Comiskey Snyder before and her MS and how it's completely diminished and that kind of thing. But another really cool miracle. And this is God working through people. And maybe you don't even think it's a miracle. It's just a really great coincidence. But these people were swimming and somehow they got caught in a rip current tide and they ended up way offshore. I think it's by Jacksonville. And they both started praying to God. They're like, God, just give us a sign. Just please help us out. We've got to get out of this terrible situation. We were way offshore. They thought they might drown. And suddenly this boat pulls up and it's called the Amen. How cool is that?
Wow,
So I think God does work
cool.
through people. And the person with the Amen, they said they were going to change the name of their boat, but after that, they decided they were going to keep the name.
Wow, that's a cool story. And I think you're right that I think there are people even on earth today who have done more miracles than Jesus did. Heidi Baker is a good example. I'm pretty sure she's done more miracles than Jesus, and I think
What'd
there's a
she
lot of
do?
people like that. Oh, well, she's a missionary in Mozambique, and she originally started an orphanage there, and then she began planting churches, and she would go into villages in Mozambique and basically just say, "What kind of miracle do you guys need? Our God does miracles." They've seen a lot of blind people healed, a lot of deaf people completely healed, people with
Wow.
all kinds of diseases. And so that's anyway, we could do a whole topic show on the things that go on in her ministry, but and there's other people like that too.
I'd love to read more on that. I've heard, and I haven't bought this book, but I've heard Craig Keener has collected a whole bunch of miracles. And I think that might be something worth reading. And I read Lee Strobel's book on miracles, and I thought that was really good.
Yeah. Um, Now, I would love to talk to you sometime about Isaiah and Daniel because I think those are kind of controversial in that in Isaiah it seems like there are some prophecies that maybe people are saying, how have these been fulfilled, or are they yet to be fulfilled? Have you like done a lot of work on that?
Yeah. Well, first place, that pastor on the plane pointed me to Isaiah 53, which I could not believe was in the Jewish scriptures, because I'm like, oh my gosh, that's Jesus Christ. It's so clear. And so, because he asked me, he said, who am I describing? And I told him, but then I didn't really look at the rest of Isaiah very carefully until probably about a year ago, when I started really digging into it. And here's the amazing thing. So you have Isaiah. Now he's in the 8th century BC, and he's in the under the captivity of the Assyrians. And so the northern kingdom had gone into captivity under the Assyrians, and he predicted that the Jewish people were going to be going into another captivity that the Babylonians, specifically named, would be bringing the Assyrians, bringing the Jewish people into exile, which of course occurred over 100 years later, around the very beginning of the 6th century, or I'm sorry, the 7th century BC. And so that's when we learn about Daniel. That's when Daniel comes into the picture. So then in 586 BC, we've got this whole idea of the temple being destroyed. And of course, Isaiah predicted that too. And then the temple was rebuilt in 516, and Isaiah predicted that too. He didn't predict the specific years. Of course, he didn't say it's 580, whatever the year would have been then, but he predicted that it was going to fall and it'd be rebuilt, and it was going to be rebuilt under the Medo-Persian kingdom. And so Isaiah also predicted that it was going to be not only that, but the call to rebuild it was going to come from, or the permission to rebuild it was going to come initially from King Cyrus, which Isaiah named specifically. And a lot of people get crazy when they read that. And so especially people who started reading it around the 18th century and 19th century. So they started creating this thing called Deutero-Isaiah theory, where they posited that rather than being a prophet, as we know he is, Jesus told us he is too, and so did lots of others, but rather than being a prophet, some Isaiah school of people were busy inserting scriptures into the scripture over this period of years. And somehow all the Jewish people must keep updating their Bibles. It's like so ridiculous. It's like they said that Isaiah really was written more like around the 5th century, because they wanted to put him in a time that was after all these prophecies that he had said it. And so they created this whole thing, and he was inserting passages. And of course, that means traipsing all around the kingdom, finding every single Bible and inserting new passages and updates. And that's absolutely crazy to even think. And so that's what happened. And then Daniel, of course, is really cool, because Daniel predicted the succession of 4 kingdoms. He specifically named 3 of them. So he was in the Babylonian kingdom. He also was around for King Cyrus, but he predicted this Medo-Persians would take over. And then he predicted that the Greeks, specifically named, the Greeks would take over from the Medo-Persians, which of course happened hundreds of years later under Alexander the Great in the 3rd century BC. And then he predicted a 4th kingdom. He didn't name that one, but it's the Roman kingdom, where the Messiah was going to come from. And of course, that occurred, as you know. And then he gave us even the 77s less 7 in Daniel 9, and predicted the exact timing of a lot of these events, which is super cool. And so he told us when the call to rebuild Jerusalem goes out, which is between 457 and 444, it was 2 calls. We have this window of time that 483 years is going to pass before the anointed one's cut off. And guess what? The anointed one was cut off in 33 AD. And that's right around the window of time of the 483 years between those two those 2 sets of years. So super cool stuff. And so when you read that, if you want your faith to be strengthened, just realize it's pretty neat stuff that's in there. And that's why I love those 2 books.
Cool. Thanks for sharing. Now, are there any parts of the Bible that are difficult for you?
No. Just kidding. Yes, of course. There's certain parts. And it's so funny, because I was working with, what was her name? Oh, I forget her name all of a sudden. Oh, Salah. Salah was just on Myth Vision's channel, and I was working with her, and from Jonathan Sheffield. And we were talking about what the atheists were probably going to ask her in this debate. She was debating an atheist. And we said, what you don't want to do is go into the Old Testament, because if you bring up the Old Testament, they're going to bring up certain passages that are very difficult for us in the Old Testament. And so, of course, they did. And Selah she's just out of high school, and she did this phenomenal job against this PhD. And so I was blown away by what great work she did and how God really worked through her. So if you guys want to hear some of those passages and hear her responses, go over to Myth Vision's channel. And here you've got like a David and Goliath situation where I thought she did a phenomenal job. But the passages where God, you could wrestle with what he talks about with the Midianites and the Canaanites and that kind of thing. And I think it's one of those things where, as Selah said, these were completely different cultures, and taking our modern day lens and applying it to those cultures isn't really appropriate.
Okay. So are some of like the difficult passages for you maybe like slavery and like, I mean, what would be difficult for you?
I would say we have to remember that the Old Testament's descriptive. It's not prescriptive. It's merely describing what happened. Slavery, I don't actually have a big problem with that, because it was so prevalent in every single country of the world in ancient times, and all the way up until, of course, in the Western world, we've eliminated it, but they haven't even eliminated it still in some parts of the world. And so it was just part of living. It was a foundation of their economic system. And so that I don't have as much of a problem with. The hardest part for me is when God tells the Israelites, this is a very hard part. He tells the Hebrews, okay, you have to, and Joshua and that kind of thing, you have to go in there, and we're warning the Canaanites, but if anyone stays, we're pushing them out of their land. If anyone stays, you have to kill all of them. Now that's very difficult, because clearly there would have, if people chose to stay with their babies, which I think would have been a really foolish move, but if women chose to stay with their babies, it would include those people too. And so, of course, that's very difficult to reconcile.
Yeah. Now, what helps you overcome that? So, like, if, like some people will look at that and say, yeah, so isn't it clear that we shouldn't worship this God who would, command such a thing? How do you respond to that?
Here's what I think about. I think about God's incredible omniscience, and God knows the potential of every single person on this world. And I also think about his sovereignty, and he knows he is in control of the world, and he has a certain vision of the world of how he wants it to be. And if he decided today, for example, to go extinguish ISIS, because he knows the potential for the ISIS people 400 years from now and how that could corrupt society in 400 years, or those kind of things, if he decided to do that, then it's appropriate. And so we know that the views on the Canaanites, these people were sacrificing their own children to Baal. They were burning them. They found places where there's just bodies of these little teeny babies who had been charred to death. And so the Canaanites were doing some horrific things. And they thought the reason they were doing them was a morally corrupt reason. They thought that if they sacrificed their babies, they would have better crops. They think the gods would bless them with better crops if they sacrificed their babies. And they were also having sex in the temples with each other, incestuous relationships, bestiality, all these things these people were doing was just corrupting society. And God realized that if that's to go on, even the babies would be in that kind of environment. So I would grow up into that kind of environment and become like those kind of people. And so I think God just we have to give God sovereignty there to make his executive decisions and say, I am the one who gives life, and I'm the one who takes life away. And that speaks to abortion. That completely speaks to, I know a lot of people are probably pretty crazy hostile about Roe v. Wade, but that speaks to abortion, because that's exactly what some women think today. Those who choose to do an abortion out of convenience, or those whose boyfriends force them to do it, or the family forces them to do it. A lot of times, even on that channel, on Salah's channel, with Salah and Jennifer, her name was Jennifer something, I'm forgetting her last name, but even with Salah and Jennifer, she said that she was in the middle of her career, and her career was going to flourish much more if she didn't have to keep the baby who was inside of her. So she aborted the baby because her career was more important. Now, it just harkens back to the sacrifice of the children for the crops. It's like really crazy.
Yeah. Kind of switching gears a little bit. Are there any hard things about being a Christian?
Yes. The hardest thing is I'm not a perfect person. I make a lot of mistakes. And the hardest thing is trying to live as well as you can, be an example to my family. Sometimes I get impatient with my kids, I get impatient with my husband, and I have to just remember, okay, that was the you in 2008, 2009. This was the you back then, and this is not the you today. You've got to be nicer, kinder, a better representative of Christianity, and that's constantly over my head. It's easy for me when I'm outside of the house to go to work and be really pleasant. Everything's really fun, and I don't lose my temper or anything like that when I'm anywhere else besides sometimes in my house. When somebody does something and I kind of lose a little bit, and then I'm like, no, stop, you can't, calm down. You can't be like that. And that's really hard. It's really hard.
Yeah. What are the like benefits and positive things that you've seen in your life since becoming a Christian?
Well, one is me. I was kind of I look back at, I'll put it this way. My sister-in-law and brother-in-law, my husband's twin brother, and their two sons just came and stayed with us for I think 5 days. They also stayed with us last summer for 9 days at one point. We always go and see them over on the other coast. We're such good friends right now. And you wouldn't even know that the kind of relationship that we had back in 2008, when they moved over from their house in Boca Raton, they moved over here to live in our neighborhood. And at some point, I just got really, for some reason, I developed this dislike of them, this intense dislike. And I had all of these terrible conjured up reasons in my head. And it ended up pushing them out. They ended up leaving and going back to Boca. And we weren't talking. And it was really bad for my husband. And it was just an awful, awful environment. And now I see when they come over, we couldn't be more loving to each other. It's such a beautiful relationship. We're so comfortable. We plan all our trips together. We're actually going to go later this month. We're figuring out where we're going to go. But we do all that stuff together because it's much more fun with them than without them. And so we just went on a big trip last summer to St. Augustine, all of us together. We went to the Keys before that. It's really fun with them.
Cool. So do you feel like then when you became a Christian, God naturally put love in your heart for people that was there before?
Mm-hmm. I absolutely think that. I changed even starting around 2011, 2012, my whole self just kind of changed. And so, and I know that they see it. I know my husband sees it. I know my kids, they wouldn't have known, but they were very little back then, but they can see it. And I'm sure the other family sees it because of how I drove them out of the area. It's terrible. I mean, we had an excuse for why they left. They didn't say it was because of me, but I knew it was because of me. I knew it was my horrible ways. And so, yeah, that's embarrassing.
Do you think, a lot of people who watch my channel, who don't believe in God, say, hey, I have no problem being a loving and good person. I don't need God in order to do that. How do you respond to that? Like, do you think that people need God in order to be loving?
No, I think people can be I've met some really loving atheists and agnostics. And I look at my own brother, who's an agnostic, and he's the one who's from Germany. I might have mentioned him before, but he's extremely loving. He's a wonderful dad. He lives a perfect life. I have no idea why he's agnostic. It doesn't make any sense to me. I can't figure him out, but he's certainly an example of a very good man. I mean, he's right now he's staying with my dad and he's cooking him meals and doing all this kind of stuff. He just came here from Germany and he's going to go back to Germany, but he's definitely there can be great people. I mean, he's a really good person. So
yeah, I sometimes wonder because I noticed a profound change in me too when I started following Jesus, and when I really had my first experience with God loving me, it changed me and like gave me such a love for other people that I really did not have before. And so I've seen major changes in me, and that kind of makes me wonder if it's easier for those of us who were kind of like worse sinners to come to know Jesus, and maybe some of the like nicer people don't really see their need for him. What do you think about that?
I think, you just reminded me of when Jesus was talking to Simon. I think it was Simon. He's like, Simon, Simon, which one of these is going to worship me more, or is going to be more appreciative? The one who's owes me a ton, or the one that owes me very little? And he's like, well, of course, it's the one who owes you a ton who's going to appreciate you more. And that's definitely me. Definitely
Exactly.
owed him a ton.
Yes, exactly. Um, yeah, that's a great response. And so I guess Jesus answered that question for us, right? Um, so what is your like experience? You've talked to, you said like when you were first coming to know the Lord, you had some dreams and stuff. What is your relationship with God like on a regular basis? Like how do you experience God?
I don't get out of bed in the morning until I've said a lot of prayers. So I start every day with I actually lay in my bed. I pull the sheets over myself because I want to just be in total silence, total darkness, no distractions. And I just start praying, and I start praying the Our Father. That's the first one that I do. I'll say the Our Father, the whole thing. And then I'll start asking for my individual needs. And I'll just say things like, please work through me today. Please let me be as kind as possible. Please let me show who you are to other people. I do that every single day to start the day. And I think
Wow.
that's my best and that's and I pray sometimes when I'm riding my bike. I'm just thinking about it kind of makes me sad when I think about how much I should be appreciative of the flawed human that I am. But I wake up and I try to just remind you, please, Lord, please help me, please work through me. This terrible person. So
Wow. That's really touching that you say your prayers every morning before you get out of bed. That's a good idea. I don't really do that. But that's kind of inspiring me. Um, so what is your experience with church since becoming a Christian?
I love church, and I have to admit, I haven't been to church enough lately. And we kind of fell out of the habit with COVID, and now we've been slacking off a little bit, but I love church, and it's something that it, every time I go in there, that's when I really start crying, is because I get in there and there's so much joy in there, and there's so much just praise and worship, and especially with the music. The music brings tears to my eyes every single time. And I love that. And then the pastors, they tell the most amazing sermons. Now, if I say didn't go to church, it's not that I'm not listening to church, because I do listen to it. They have it on YouTube. And so I listen to the church live when it's running, if I'm not there myself. But the pastors really dig into the Bible and explain stuff in a very great way that opens my eyes a lot. And so I've written blogs sometimes where I've talked about what the pastor said or what their message was. And they're amazing. And I can definitely see God working through people in that church. And some of the best people I've ever seen are in that church. They're just such kind, loving people. I wasn't surprised when I saw there's a woman called Debbie, and my neighbor, Jeff, who's now married to my sister, is like, Jeff was across the street from us, and his wife Pam unfortunately developed brain cancer, and she passed away. And this is actually right around the same time when I was coming back to God. It was right around 2011 and 2012, and I don't remember exactly. I think she passed away September of 2012, but it was right around that period of time. And I remember what happened was they had a little daughter, and the daughter was only in first grade, and the daughter's my son's age, my youngest son, and they had adopted the daughter, and unfortunately Pam passed away. And then what happened was Debbie, who's a total angel, comes out of nowhere. And she was sort of a friend a little bit. Her daughter was a friend of Tasha's, but she came out of pretty much nowhere and just started really helping Jeff out and taking Tasha everywhere, taking her to the Girl Scouts, doing all these different things, taking Tasha on trips, and just really kind of being a mom to Tasha that she didn't have anymore. And it was tremendous. And I just look at Debbie and I'm like, this is a total angel. And it was no surprise when I realized she actually goes to the same church. I'd see her in the services, because that is an angel. When they say there's angels among us, that's right there. That's Debbie for sure.
Wow. And is this the same Baptist church that you were talking about at the beginning? Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. So do you kind of consider yourself a Baptist?
Kind of, yeah. But if I leave this area, I might go to a different church. I have to be honest. I I'm like, I think Ben Franklin said something like that. He chooses the church that's close to him. And this Baptist church I love, and I love the style. But if I walked into another church if we move, when we eventually move, like if I go back to Boca, I'll go back to St. Paul Lutheran Church, because that church has contemporary services now, and they have really good pastors over there. And so I'll end up back as a Lutheran. So I'm not married to the denomination.
Yeah, I got it. And Baptist can be such a broad term because I grew up Baptist, but that, like, when you say Baptist, there's so many different types of Baptists and so many different experiences that people can have as Baptists. So
Yeah, and
doesn't
some
always.
experiences aren't so great, unfortunately. I've heard about some of the things going on, and it's so tragic when there's a church that goes awry, because it makes all the other churches, it kind of stains everybody else. So if you've got a couple of bad leaders, that's one of the reasons I left the Catholic Church, is because some of the, and it's terrible, but I didn't like the way the Pope wasn't addressing some of the issues in the church, and it was too prevalent for me. I kept hearing about it going on, and I kept thinking, why aren't they fixing this? And so, but I'm not against the Catholic Church, and I'm not against my Catholic brothers and sisters, and so that's.
Well, now with like regard to like, okay, so I don't know if this is what you're referring to, but the Southern Baptist Convention, and that has been like had a lot of problems with the way
Mhm.
that they've treated women. So is that kind of what you're referring to? Like
That
with
that
the
and
sexual.
also some of the abuse, yeah, sexual abuse going on, and same thing in the Catholic
Yeah.
Church, sexual abuse. It's I think these people are supposed to be men and women of God. Why are they doing this? And it's usually men, unfortunately. So it's, why are they doing this stuff? And even my dad, one of the things is I'm really upset about is my dad fell away from the church, and he's never come back, and he's 80 now, and he has no desire to go to it because he's so upset. And there was this example right in his area in Delray, where these two priests who aren't supposed to be getting married, these two priests took their girlfriends and a whole bunch of money from the church out to Las Vegas and went gambling on a gambling spree. So all the money that people had donated, a bunch of it went on a gambling spree in Las Vegas. And I think, why do these people are supposed to be people of God? Why are they doing this? It's terrible.
Yeah. Um. So, like with regard to the way most Baptist churches, or a good portion of them, think about women in ministry, like, what are your thoughts about women in ministry and what the Bible says about women?
Now people probably won't like what I'm going to say about this, because I'm much more old fashioned than I used to be about this, because I decided I was going to dig in and see what Jesus said about this. And so I think I'm going to go with what Jesus said. And Jesus said there's this clear order. So there's the church, there's the male, and then there's the female. Now I know a lot of females, or especially feminists, don't like that, but that particular order is how God structured it. And so that's just how it is. Now, can females lead the church? I think that's the big question. I think women in ministry is absolutely perfect. And Phoebe, Lydia, we've got plenty of Junia, we have plenty of examples of women leaders even who are doing different things and given lots of responsibilities. But I think that the structure that God has set out, even in the family, is supposed to be the male is the head and then the female. And I know, again, some females aren't going to like that. And I used to not like that. I used to think that was the most awful thing ever. But then I decided, Steph, be a little more humble. Read what it says. So.
Well, what is it that Jesus says that makes you think there's a hierarchy like that?
I can't. Well, some of the specific passages are like 1 Timothy 2:12 and those kinds of passages where it gives different roles. And I don't remember exactly what the other passages were, but there's definitely a lot of them. There are passages that do the order of how it works out, where it's the male, then the female. And so I would think that from that, it looks like God's ordained males to be the senior pastors in the churches, but he's not saying that females can't also lead with them, especially like couples leading. I think they like the idea with Priscilla and Aquila. The idea that a couple is leading in the church, that's certainly appropriate. And so you could see women leaders through that route.
Mm-hmm.
I know.
Okay.
Am I going against? You probably have the other.
Oh yeah, I mean, this is completely like I believe totally the opposite. I mean, I'm egalitarian, and I believe that those few passages that you're referring to are just misinterpreted. So, and I think we the good principle that we follow when we read the Bible is that we interpret unclear passages based on more clear passages. And some of those, there's probably like 3 passages that are a little bit difficult about women, and they're not clear passages. They're quite confusing in the way that they're in the text. Like just the one in First Timothy that you mentioned is like the biggest one that actually it's completely nonsensical. It's either completely contradictory to what Paul says in other places, or it's just so. I think that something, there is a misinterpretation going on for those who take that and use that to say that women should not, be teachers and pastors and that kind of thing. So I mean, I've made videos on all those passages about women. And I mean, those were, at one time I believed like you. At one time I believed that, there was that women shouldn't be pastors or be an authority and that kind of thing. Like that there was sort of like a women's roles and men's roles and all that. I bought into all that stuff. But I continued to seek clarity, because even when I believed all that, those passages did not make sense, right? The women being silent in the churches, that flat out does not make sense in the context of what Paul is saying. And so, even when I bought into all this women's role stuff, these passages were completely confusing. So
I think I can say I did listen to what N.T. Wright has said on 1 Timothy 2:12, and I think that N.T. Wright gives a lot of clarity on that. And so the idea was women aren't supposed to usurp authority, like wrongly take authority over a man. I think that's kind of what Paul's touching on. But the idea of silence also was, and from what N.T. Wright has said, was actually kind of related to give them time to reflect and think. The idea of being silent is to be able to listen to what you're hearing and that kind of thing. And it's rather than just constant chatterboxing going on. And so I would agree with that. And I think 1 Timothy 2:12 can be taken in different ways, just like you're saying.
Yeah. So, now what do you say to people who think that the Gospels are not reliable? Since you do a lot of apologetics, I just, I don't really get that much into apologetics myself, but, I'm interested in the way that you approach that when people say, well, you can't trust the Gospels testimony about Jesus.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. First, they'll say that the Gospels are totally anonymous. But if you go back in history, you see that there's lots of ancient references to the named authors of the Bible and given attributions from the early church fathers to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so I think that itself, there's no evidence of any other names. There's no evidence of any other authors. There's a lot of internal evidence. Like in Matthew, we know that Matthew's a tax collector, and he's the only one who reports a couple of things that a tax collector would like to report, like the fact that Peter was able to get a coin out of his mouth and then pay the taxes with that. That's mentioned in the book of Matthew. Luke and Mark are just sort of obscure figures. They weren't anything special. So the fact that we have Luke the doctor and Mark who traveled with Paul, we have those people, but they weren't these major characters of the apostles. So I think that gives some reliability itself. John has a lot of internal evidence that a fisherman would want to say, like the fact that 153 fish were caught. He counted the fish. That's what a fisherman would do. And he mentions a lot of the stories about fishing. And so that would be consistent with being the son of Zebedee and the brother of James. And so we have that kind of thing. And I think that and I think who I listened to on this recently was David Wood and Jonathan McClatchy. David Wood and Jonathan McClatchy. Jonathan McClatchy was summarizing some of the undesigned coincidences. And that is the kind of thing that's really cool, because I just did a blog where I took the story of the feeding of the 5,000, because all 4 Gospels talk about the miraculous feeding of the 5,000 from 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Or was it 2 loaves of bread and 5 fish? I forget. I think it was 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. All of them tell that story, but each of them gives this little teeny detail, that you can take the other one and blend it all together. So one of them tells it's very green grass, and that would be consistent with the timing of it during the Passover, which another one mentions. One of them tells us that Jesus asked someone else for, I forget who he asked, but Philip. Jesus asked Philip where they could go to get some food. And why did he ask Philip? Well, we learned earlier in the book of John that Philip happened to live in the same place where the feeding of the 5,000 took place. And so there's all these little passages that weave together in a really interesting way. And so, and that's not alone. It's the idea behind that is, if the authors were putting it together hastily or putting it together in a way that they were corroborating or doing things like that, they would have been much more, it would be just a little bit different. But we've got these gospels all put together with these strange little comments, like the grass was very green, and silly things like that, that it's undesigned, it's unplanned. And I think that gives authenticity to it.
Very cool. What do you think about, there's been some criticism and questioning of me on the channel regarding, the similarities between, it looks like, it does seem that Matthew copied a lot off of Mark, and Luke also. There's a lot of places where it's word for word. And so some people have said, well, clearly Matthew didn't write Matthew because, he just basically copied off Mark. And would he really do that if he was, an eyewitness to this, if this was his story? So what do you think about that?
I think that Jesus, the fact that he had probably a 3-year ministry, I think he probably told a lot of his stories over and over, just like priests do when you go to the churches, and pastors. A lot of times they'll tell some of the same stories and some of the same messages. And I think a lot of them were around Jesus, and he was telling people these stories, and they decided to write it down. And the fact that they put it to paper in the same way just tells us that they probably experienced it in the same way. And Mark was told by Peter. And so Peter shared with Mark a lot of the information. Luke was told a lot by Paul, because Luke traveled with Paul, which we're told in the book of Acts. Luke was accompanying Paul. And so Paul shared what he knew. Paul knew Peter very well. And so we've got a little connection with a lot of that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So actually, Luke's took pains to do, if people want to know the order of it all, Luke is the only one that's written in chronological order, which is kind of interesting. So if you wanted to piece together the 4 gospels, you start with Luke. That's the order. And then you take the other gospels and look at it. And so all 4 gospels report that women, by the way, this is Jesus exalting women, discovered the empty tomb first. So women, in fact, a woman was the first one to hear that Jesus was coming to our planet. The very first one was Mary. So Gabriel told Mary, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. So she's the very first one to get to know. So certainly we've got some elevation there.
Cool. And what is your, how do you think, like, the idea about Mary, since you were raised Catholic, and, Catholics tend to give a lot more honor to Mary than Protestants do. Where do you fit in on that?
I'm in the middle. I don't revere Mary in some of the ways that I see some Catholics revering her, and they pray to her. And it's kind of funny with the rosary, because on the rosary, which I grew up on, you'd say, I think 9 or 10 Hail Marys to your one Our Father. And I think that order should be the reverse. I still think Mary's very important. And I think we should definitely look up to her as the first mother, a mother who was kind of similar in certain ways to the very first woman on the planet. But I think Mary does answer prayers. I think Mary's very active, and I think Mary still does do those appearances. I believe that it was Mary at Lourdes, and it was Mary over there with Fatima, and I believe all that kind of stuff. So I have a certain reverence for Mary that definitely goes beyond what the Protestants think. But what I don't think, and I don't agree with, is I looked at the passages of Mary being a perpetual virgin, because that's what a lot of Catholics believe, that she was a perpetual virgin, and she also did not sin. And they think that she did not sin because Jesus would have been in a vessel that was without sin. And I think that so I decided to look at the passages that talk about whether or not she's a virgin. And I see that there's a lot in there about Jesus's brothers. And so the people who posit that ignore that, and they'll say, well, he was really just a cousin. And then they say that Joseph consummated the marriage after giving birth to Jesus. And I think that's really clear in the passages. So clearly that doesn't mean that she's a virgin. So the Catholics are taking it a little too far with Mary. And sorry, Catholics, if you're in the chat. I mean, there's certain things that they tell us about Mary that the Catholic Church decided to sort of twist way back when and pretend that Jesus didn't have brothers and sisters, but it's reported quite clearly he did.
Yes. Yeah, and there's a couple questions here in the chat. And SJ, do you want people to write questions for you?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so if you're in the chat, if you have questions, I'm not going to go all the way back through the chat. So if you put a question earlier and you want SJ to answer, then please put it in the chat now. One question that came up here, though, Lena says, Mary was Eve. So could you expound a little bit on what you mean about like the connection between Mary and Eve?
That's actually, I probably misspoke a little bit on that because I was thinking about Eve in some ways was good, but Eve, of course, was the one who also told Adam that they should eat from the fruit from the tree of life, so, or tree of knowledge or whatever. So I think maybe that's not a very good connection. I think I misspoke
Well,
a
I
little
think
bit.
there is a connection there, so I'll share a little bit then. I think Mary is the reversal of Eve. So Mary has a role in our salvation, just as Eve had a role in the fall of humanity. Mary is the reversal of that, because while Eve chose not to trust in God's good intentions for her, and was tempted by this idea of, hey, like God's holding out on you. You're not getting the knowledge of good and evil. Basically like God knows that if you eat of it, your eyes will be opened. And so Eve was tempted to not trust in God's intentions for her. And Mary is the reversal of that. Mary trusted in God. She trusted in the word of the angel. The angel basically told her, look, you're going to become pregnant. And Mary was like, how's that going to happen? I haven't had a sexual relationship with a man. How's that going to happen? And, Mary knew what it would mean for her to be found pregnant without being married. And she chose to trust in God's good intention for this situation. So she really was kind of the reversal of Eve, and played a huge role in our salvation, in bringing forth our Savior. So
I love that. That's a really good way to look at it. So I'm going to borrow that if you don't mind.
Of course. And then Gorgeous Roddy Chrome says, isn't praying to a saint kind of blasphemous? So I wanted to ask you, SJ, you said you think Mary does answer prayers, and that, Mary appears to people. Do you pray to Mary?
I don't. I actually pray to Jesus, and I did pray to Mary a lot growing up. And so I can say I was doing that because Catholics pray a lot to Mary, and they believe she's an intercessor. And they also pray to the saints. So that's something Gorgeous Roddy Chrome is saying right there. Isn't it kind of blasphemous? And probably because of now my Protestant background, I've just sort of changed and realized that I want to pray directly to Jesus. I don't pray to Mary as I did. I do believe I had an experience when I was in college, though, with a woman who appeared, spiritual form appeared to me, and I thought at the time it was Mary, and she comforted me, and it was when I was having a really hard time, and so I did have that experience, and my sister had an experience that I think I told you before, when she was with the rip current, she heard a woman's voice, and she also attributed that to Mary. So I do think Mary's active in this world as well.
Cool. Okay, so I'm waiting to see if there's any questions that come up in the chat, because there were some earlier. So basically, let me see here. Okay, I'm not sure if this is, okay, what is this? Matthew 25, Brian Stevens says, the author writes 15 loaves and 10 fishes. Since Matthew is numbering the fish here, is this good evidence the author was a fisherman? Oh, he's just giving you a hard time because you said about John and the fish. Okay. Why did I know that was going to be it?
Brian.
Okay. So, yeah, Travis wants to know, does SJ think evolution is true?
I have to, and I've said this before when you were on my other channel, I do not have enough knowledge about evolution to talk about what, I mean, I really don't have enough knowledge. That's not the topic I studied in college. I didn't study biology. I told you before, I took classes in meteorology, historical geology, and astronomy, and I did not take a class in biology. And so my biology comes from high school. And so, no, I don't have enough. So and a book that I bought on biology, I bought a biological textbook that's by Campbell and colleagues, but, but I don't, like, it doesn't matter to me either way. You know what I'm saying? So.
Yeah. So hold on. Now here's a Jerome says, can we go back to SJ's comments about abortion doctors and how they should be treated? What was up with that?
I don't know if I said anything
I don't
about
remember you
abortion
saying
doctors.
something about abortion doctors.
No, I didn't say anything about abortion doctors. I can say something, though, that I'm working on that is kind of interesting on abortions. I was looking at those, and did you freeze a little bit? Or is it just, I can't tell if you guys can. She's a little bit frozen, but I can say I'm working on a paper right now. Oh, there, you're back. Good.
Yeah, sorry. I guess my internet went out for a minute. I'm glad you're still here. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, please. Good. So no, I'm working on a paper. I just started, and this is for my academic field, but I decided to do a paper on crisis pregnancy centers. And that apparently there's about 3,000 crisis pregnancy centers, and they call them now pregnancy resource centers. But there's 3,000 of them in the United States, and they keep getting firebombed by arsonists and people who are protesting Roe v. Wade decision. And I thought to myself, well, I wonder what are the academics saying about crisis pregnancy centers? And so I've learned a few things. I've learned that there are very few Planned Parenthood clinics. A lot of those are going out of business, even though they say that abortions only represent 3% of their business. A lot of them are going out of business. And so there's only a few hundred of them in the United States. Those are what provide abortions to a lot of women. And so going to the pregnancy resource centers, the reason I'm bringing that up is because these are some amazing centers where women can go and have all these services. They get diapers, they get formula, all kinds of stuff like that is given to them. And a lot of those centers are coming under fire because they try to talk women out of having abortions. And so people think, what are these centers doing, telling these women they shouldn't have an abortion and giving them other options and telling them about adoption options and those kind of things and giving them free counseling and ultrasounds and that kind of stuff. But what I found with respect to abortions that I think a lot of people don't realize is one, there's evidence. We've got tons of meta-analytical studies, which take a bunch of studies and put them together. And they've shown that if you have a surgical abortion, meaning that's the one with the clips or whatever, you have an abortion where it's not with the pill, you're more likely to have a preterm pregnancy later, meaning it's going to be before 37 weeks. And so that's been shown in lots of studies, and they tell you that in those pregnancy resource centers. And they also, some academics have said they're lying about that, but then I went and looked at the research. And then I also looked at this other situation of breast cancer and the likelihood of getting breast cancer. And so there are studies that are mainly conducted in the West that are very, very conflicting about that. Some of them make it really clear that you're more likely to get breast cancer if you have either a medical or a surgical abortion. And some say you're less likely. Some say you're not likely. It's a null deal. But here's the interesting thing. In the West, we have very high height is corresponding to bigger chance of getting breast cancer. Drinking alcohol, smoking, a lot of the things that are going on in the West, obesity. So if you want to have a study, that you have to control for all of those factors. But of course, people lie, like, especially if you're sitting there with breast cancer and you don't want to be held accountable by your doctor, you're not going to want to fess up that, oh, by the way, I smoke a pack of cigarettes every day, or I drink lots and lots of alcohol or something like that. So I think to conduct those studies, the better ones would come out of places where people are very unlikely to smoke and drink. And so I looked at the cigarette smoking rates and the drinking rates and obesity levels in the eastern part of the world, in southern countries like in India and places like that, in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and China. And I found some meta-analytic studies that did draw links in those places between smoking and breast cancer that are significant. And so the thing is, people don't want to talk about that because that obviously has some implications that they're not comfortable with. And there's also pretty high prevalence of getting a pelvic inflammatory disease that can lead to infertility. So if you have a medical abortion, it's something like 4.9%. If it's a surgical abortion, it's 2.4%. And I might be reversed on that. I got to double check which one's surgical and which one's medical, but that's a pretty significant percentage.
Yeah. Okay. Here's another question. Spartan Theology says SJ said that Jesus took the bullet for us, but who shot the gun? If she says the Father, how can she preserve the harmony of the Trinity in that view?
I think we as sinners shot the gun. And so it's like we're shooting all these guns, just like we as sinners the sinners were the ones who took Jesus down and falsely accused him, ripped their garments and started crucifying him. So we as sinners are the ones. Would you say that's
Yes,
fair?
I agree. Totally agree. Yep. Okay, I don't know if you want to answer this one. This is a controversial question these days. What is a woman?
I don't talk about this on Twitter or anything like that, but I did see parts of Matt Walsh's movie, and I watched a bunch of reviews. I don't belong to Daily Wire, so I didn't watch the full movie, and I got the gist of it. I think my YouTube videos were enough to get the gist of it, but I think it's quite easy to define a woman, a female, a female human. So I don't see any difficulty in that at all. And so I know that these days people see difficulty in that. And it's also the same thing going back to abortion. How do you define what is a human being? What is inside you when you're pregnant? Is that a human being? And when does life begin? And so all the biologists, 95% of them say life begins at fertilization or conception. And so.
Now, here's Nidamos says, how did we put our sins onto Christ? Did she read Romans? I don't know if I quite understand, Nidamos. You might have to expound on your question.
I think when he was on the cross, Jesus took on the sins of the world. So that's why he said, Father, Father, why hast thou forsaken me? Because he had taken on the sins. So it seemed like God wasn't there because God can't be part of sin.
Mm-hmm. Now, Brian says, maybe we shot the gun, but God loaded it by putting the tree and the serpent in the garden with the knowledge Eve would be tempted. SJ's thoughts.
I think God gave us free will. And the serpent is this idea of, and I like how C.S. Lewis puts it. He talks about, do we have a yin and a yang, or is there some sort of dualism where good and evil are on the same level? But rather, we have free will, and God has given us free will, and he gave the angels, they had free will too. And a third of them fell away from God, and Satan was one of them. So Satan's on the planet. He unfortunately has some sort of representation or some sort of he had authority. That's what Jesus came and took away from him and any of the other spiritual beings that were on the planet at that time. Jesus took it all back. But I think God's idea is there will be temptations. There is evil. Sometimes evil is used to show us what is good. And just like perseverance, if we didn't have this planet quite the way it is, would we appreciate what love truly is if we hadn't witnessed what hate is, or that sort of thing? And so I think that, yeah, God gave us free will, and he knew when he did that we were going to sin. And that Jesus was going to have to come and forgive us of our sins. Those of us who want him to forgive. I mean, he forgives everybody if you repent and you ask him. It's a question of not everybody's going to do that.
Yeah. Now, since Jesus triumphed over the powers of darkness with the cross, why do you think we still experience them as if they still have that power?
Yeah, well, they still do. And even in Jesus's thing even in the book of Acts, we still have demons and that sort of thing. And so they're still here. They just don't have the authority that they once had. And so he triumphed over them and their authority on the planet. Like, I think Michael Heiser does a lot of work on this when he talks about Psalm 82, and it talks about the divine council and how they were given authority at that point. And then Jesus came and he took the authority back. So in all the kingdoms that the apostles went to, and all of the other missionaries, the early missionaries like Paul, all of the places they went were all of these places that had been under the authority of these spiritual beings. And so Jesus reclaimed that, but they're still around, unfortunately. there's definitely still, we're still in a spiritual battle.
Mm-hmm. B.S. Lewis wants to know what happened to all those sins. Like, if Jesus took our sins, what happened to all those sins?
Yeah, it's like, I think they washed up in the ocean. I don't know. I think that sins, one of the things that we do still see a little bit in the Bible is the ripple effect of sins. So that's one thing is there, it carries through. So when you sin, a lot of times then your kids sin, then they see your sins, maybe they duplicate the same sins later. So unfortunately, there is kind of a ripple effect from sins. But
yeah. Is there anything else that I didn't cover today that you wanted to share?
Well, I enjoy coming on your channel. I can say this is a lot of fun, and you've got a lot of people watching. 54. That's pretty good. So, I don't know what's are you actually, one question that I wanted to ask you at one point, but would you call yourself a progressive Christian, or are you? I mean, are you a universalist?
No,
Is, I guess, a question I
I think
never.
I'm a solid evangelical. If you
Are you
read
okay?
but see, I do have some views that would put me like that. Certain, the Christians who speak against progressive Christians would probably call me a progressive Christian, because I don't believe in eternal conscious torment in hell. But the reason I don't believe in that is because I don't think it's biblical. And so, the work that I've done looking into that topic has like put me just solidly believing that the Bible's teaching about the afterlife is life versus death, and I think it teaches that hundreds of times. But when Christians hear that I don't believe in eternal conscious torment in hell, then they assume I'm just dismissing the Bible and therefore I must be progressive. But no, I'm evangelical. I have a high view of scripture. And then the other view that kind of people would maybe call me a progressive Christian is that I take a very I guess soft stance on same-sex marriage. And I just think it's the kind of thing where, when I read the Bible and when I consider like human reproduction and that kind of stuff, and when I think about, it seems to me that God created male and female to be married, and but at the same time, there's been a lot of things that like God didn't say anything about, like polygamy. Like polygamy is not God's ideal, right? God didn't create one man to be with 10 women, and yet we have that throughout the Old Testament, and God doesn't really correct people on that. So for me, like when I consider a loving, monogamous, same-sex couple who is saying, look, we believe in Christ, we love Christ, we cannot fathom being married to the opposite sex. For them, it's like they couldn't imagine that kind of relationship, but they want to have a monogamous sexual relationship, and they believe that God is okay with that. I just kind of feel like, who am I to say no, actually God doesn't approve of that? I mean, I think that God may be okay with that. And so for me, I'm just, I personally don't encourage people like towards same-sex sexuality, but if somebody tells me that God has led them in that direction, then I don't oppose that. So I would say that's probably the view that makes me most considered progressive. But I'm not a progressive Christian. I take a high view of scripture. If you read the definition of a progressive Christian and the definition of an evangelical, I'm evangelical.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't. I think that the far definition of a progressive is somebody like a Randall Rouser. So I think I've had him on he's a nice guy. I've had him on my channel a couple of times, but he doubts pretty much the authenticity of the Old Testament in a lot of passages. And so a lot of his views are universalist in some way. And so I'd say he'd probably be the example. So you just have a couple of views that might be consistent, but your overall big picture is really evangelical, I would say. I agree with you. Okay. I wanted to clear that up because some people have said, I think she's progressive. And so I didn't know why they were saying that. So now we know why.
Yeah, yeah. And actually, I've been wanting to have Randall Rouser on my channel. I need to read his book because I am curious about his views. Have you read Randall Rouser's book about Jesus loved the
Jesus loves
Canaanites?
No, I haven't. I haven't read that because I like Paul Copan's book on that kind of stuff. Is God a Moral Monster? I think Paul Copan's book explains it for me. I don't like to second guess what God is really, and so that I don't know. That's why I haven't read Randall's book, because Randall's brilliant actually, and he speaks very well. He's very well thought out, but I just disagree with him. And it's funny because I had to figure out exactly what he thought. I got him on my channel. I kept asking him, and he has a way of really beating around the bush. Not saying I don't believe the Old Testament's authentic, but he says that statement comes in like a zillion words that sound beautiful, and so.
Yeah. Well, I feel like I should read his book and have Randall Rouser, and maybe I should read Paul Copan. Is that who it is?
Yeah, Copan's.
Maybe I should read his book
Copan?
too.
I think it's Copan. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, well, thanks for coming on the channel. It's been wonderful having you on. And, I hope, like Nano said, is this a best friends in the making? Maybe so.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'd love to hang out with you more.
Yeah, I agree. I want to say one thing. Someone in the chat asked twice, what is fascism?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry, Lena. I didn't put up your comment because I felt like it might be too off topic, but go for it.
I'll just say it's like what you saw in Italy in the 1940s and what you saw in Germany in the 1940s. It's this idea of very racist nationalism. And some people think that our country is going there today. But it's interesting. Some people think that DeSantis is fascist and other people think that Gavin Newsom is fascist. And so I think we're just a mess here in the United States. That's all I think.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and actually, there's a couple others, other questions in here. So, Jim Cummins wants to know: do you believe in separation of church and state?
Yes. Yeah. I don't believe that our government should be theocratic.
Right. So, let's see. I guess that's let's see. Okay, somebody wants you to go further and explain. Brian says, what is a female, SJ?
That's a tough one, mainly because if I say it's a woman with a uterus and ovaries and something like that, well, somebody says, well, what happens if the woman has her uterus removed or her or something? Then is she now no longer a woman? And so that's kind of tricky. And so I will just say someone with female cells, for example, if you're XX chromosome, that works for me. That's a female.
Now, Travis says there's 5,000 religions that exist today. How many are wrong? How do you think about other religions, SJ? And how do you know you're in the right one?
I think that's a great question. And people say, well, what if you're raised over in India and you're a Hindu? Are you going to actually be able to make it to heaven? And I do believe that Jesus is going to figure out a way to get to each and every one of us on this planet if we so desire to know the truth. And so no matter where you are, none of the other religions have Jesus. And so I think that he can work through people in other religions. And I see him making a big impact, like you've mentioned before, in the Muslim world. So.
Sorry, I'm muted. B.S. Lewis wants to know, what is a Christian?
What is a Christian? Well, usually it's a believer in Jesus Christ's resurrection.
Cool. Okay, well, it looks like there's still some more stuff coming in, but I think we've pelted you with enough questions from the audience. So thank you so much for being here, and let's do it again, please.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. And if anybody isn't already a subscriber to SJ's channel, her link is in the description. She has some great content on her channel. So I hope you'll subscribe. Thanks for being here, everybody.
Thank you.